Do you remember those Father's Day dinners? The ones no one makes anymore but meant everything back then? These were the roasts, casseroles, and backyard plates that showed love in the only way some dads knew how to receive it. When did we stop honoring that kind of quiet, homemade care? There was something about stuffed green peppers that just made them feel like a gift. These were not your average weeknight vegetables. These were holiday fare, carefully prepared and packed with flavor. A mixture of seasoned ground beef, soft white rice, and stewed tomatoes was scooped lovingly into bell peppers, then oven-baked until tender. Some families used beef broth to baste them. Others sprinkled cheese on top near the end for a gooey finish. It was a whole meal tucked into a single pepper, self-contained, filling, and always plated with a side of pride. Kids might have rolled their eyes at the vegetable shell, but dads knew better. This was comfort food with structure. It required prep, care, and oven time, which meant it was reserved for those days that really mattered, like Father's Day. It is a little old-fashioned now, maybe even fussy by today's standards. But back then, it was the kind of dish that said, "We made this just for you, and we want you to taste the effort." Ham loaf never really tried to be glamorous, but it always knew how to stand out when it needed to. For many families in the 1950s and 60s, this was the dish that made an appearance only on holidays, when the table was dressed and the good plates came out. It started with ground ham, yes, ground, mixed with breadcrumbs, eggs, and a splash of milk, shaped into a loaf and baked just like meatloaf. But what made it special was the pineapple glaze. That sticky sweet coating was brushed on halfway through baking and again right before serving. The sugary crust balanced out the saltiness of the ham and gave it a kind of retro charm. It looked glossy. It smelled amazing. It was, in a strange way, a showstopper. Dads loved it because it felt both hearty and celebratory. Kids loved it because it tasted like candy meat. These days, ham loaf has all but disappeared from the dinner table, replaced by spiral hams and fancier cuts. Salisbury steak was not really steak in the traditional sense, but try telling that to any dad who looked forward to it on his big day. It was ground beef seasoned and shaped into thick patties, then seared until brown and swimming in rich brown onion gravy. The real magic happened in the skillet, where the beef soaked up all the juices and the onions went soft and sweet. Sometimes it came with mashed potatoes, sometimes egg noodles. But it always came with that deep, savory aroma that filled the house and made you hungry the second you stepped inside. For a generation raised on diners and meat and potato meals, Salisbury steak was a home-cooked version of something you might have found on a diner menu under the words "Blue Plate Special." It was familiar, reliable, a little bit classy in its own modest way. And on Father's Day, when dads were celebrated with manly meals, this was right at the top. The porterhouse steak was never subtle. It was big, bold, and unapologetically meaty, just the way Dad liked it. This was the kind of cut you only picked up for something special. A thick slab of beef with both the tenderloin and the strip steak attached by a T-bone, it was practically a celebration in itself. On Father's Day, it meant one thing: grilling time. Out came the charcoal, out came the tongs, a little salt, a little pepper, maybe some garlic powder, and then onto the flames it went. The sizzle alone was enough to get mouths watering. But the secret weapon? Herb butter. Homemade or store-bought, it was dropped on top right as the steak came off the grill, melting into every crevice and giving it that perfect finishing touch. The result was juicy, tender, and bursting with flavor. This was not a meal for rushed evenings or casual snacking. This was a sit-down, lean back, unbuckle your belt kind of meal, and it made Dad feel like a king. Braised short ribs were not a quick meal. In fact, they were the exact opposite. They required hours in the oven, low and slow, simmering in a broth of red wine, garlic, and herbs until the meat practically fell off the bone. This was a dish built on patience. And for dads who worked hard all week, this kind of meal meant someone had spent their entire afternoon making something just for them. The ribs were served over buttered egg noodles, which caught every drop of the rich, meaty sauce. You would fork a bite, and the noodles would slide through the gravy, collecting pieces of tender rib-like treasure. It was indulgent, old-fashioned, and comforting. The kind of dinner that made everyone quiet down at the table for a moment, not because they were being polite, but because the food demanded full attention. It has faded from most kitchens now, replaced by quicker meals and leaner meats. Corned beef and cabbage might sound more like St. Patrick's Day material, but for a lot of families, it was also a Father's Day standby. It was salty, hearty, and cooked with enough care to turn even the toughest cuts of beef into something that tasted like a reward. The beef was boiled slowly with bay leaves and peppercorns until tender, then served with big wedges of cabbage, carrots, and potatoes. It was a full plate, meat and vegetables, all in one pot. Easy to make, hard to forget. For dads who grew up in immigrant households, this dish often held special meaning. It was old country food, passed down by parents who knew how to stretch every dollar. The kind of meal that taught you about flavor, thrift, and love all at once. It was not flashy, but it did not have to be. On Father's Day, it hit the table steaming and fragrant, a reminder that a good meal does not have to be expensive to feel like a feast. Stuffed pork chops were the kind of meal that made the house smell like a holiday. These were not your grocery store thin cuts. These were thick, bone-in chops sliced open and filled with apple sage dressing, then roasted until golden and juicy. The stuffing was moist, savory, and just a little sweet, with chunks of apple softening in the oven and sage perfuming the air. Every bite was a blend of textures, the crisp edge of pork, the soft heart of the stuffing, and maybe even a drizzle of gravy over the top. This was the kind of meal you set the table for. No paper plates allowed, maybe even a cloth napkin if you were feeling fancy. It showed up on Father's Day menus for one simple reason. It felt like a gesture. It took effort. It had layers, and it looked impressive even before the first bite. Sure, it has fallen out of favor. Maybe it feels too traditional, too heavy. But ask anyone who grew up with it, and they will tell you, this dish had presence. Swiss steak is not actually Swiss. That never really mattered. What did matter was the way it made the house smell, like someone had been cooking all day for someone they cared about. Swiss steak was usually made from tougher cuts of beef, like round steak, which were pounded flat, dredged in flour, and browned in a skillet. Then came the stewed tomatoes and sliced onions, which bubbled and simmered around the beef until everything was soft and saucy. It was served with mashed potatoes or sometimes over rice. But the star of the plate was that beef, fork tender, richly flavored, and covered in tomato gravy. For dads who liked their meals hearty, this was a home run. And for families who wanted to do something special without breaking the bank, it was perfect. It was budget food dressed up as comfort food, and it delivered on both. You do not see it often anymore. Maybe it feels too slow for modern life. But Swiss steak was one of those meals that made a dinner feel like an event. It was not fast. It was not fancy. It was something better than that. It was homemade, with intention. Bacon-wrapped meatloaf was a far cry from the Sunday night standby everyone got tired of. This was meatloaf done right, elevated, made with care, and yes, wrapped entirely in bacon. The inside was your standard mix, ground beef, breadcrumbs, eggs, onions, but the outside was where things got serious. Strips of bacon were layered on top, overlapping like roof tiles, and glazed with a tangy ketchup and brown sugar sauce. It baked until the bacon was crisp, the glaze was sticky, and the aroma was absolutely irresistible. On Father's Day, this was not just dinner, it was a centerpiece. Something you placed down on the table with a little extra pride. Something that made Dad lean in and say, "Now that looks good." These days, meatloaf gets a bad rap. But back then, with the right toppings and just enough love, it was transformed into something worthy of a celebration. It fed a crowd, it filled your plate, and it made even a humble ground beef dish feel like a feast. When you wrapped it in bacon, you wrapped it in respect. Swordfish steaks were not an everyday dinner. They were a treat. And they almost always meant two things: summer and something worth celebrating. In coastal towns, Father's Day meant grilling up something a little different from the usual burgers and hot dogs. That is where swordfish came in. Thick, meaty, and mild, these steaks held up beautifully on the grill. They got a quick marinade in lemon juice and olive oil, maybe with a handful of capers or a little garlic for extra flavor. Then onto the flames they went, where they picked up grill marks and a smoky aroma that turned heads. It was the kind of fish that made you feel like you were eating steak, but with a lighter, fresher bite. For dads who loved fishing, grilling, or just something a little more adventurous, this was the gold standard. It felt special. It felt grown up. These days, swordfish has gotten rarer, and the price tag can make people think twice. But in its heyday, it was a summer classic that told Dad, "You matter, and we are pulling out all the stops today." Spaghetti pie may sound like a quirky invention now, but for mid-century families, it was the perfect way to turn pasta night into a celebration. Cooked spaghetti was layered with a blend of eggs and cheese to form a crust, then topped with a rich ground chuck and tomato sauce mixture. It baked into something that looked like a pie, sliced like a pie, and was devoured like the main event it was. This was no dainty Italian dinner. It was hearty, cheesy, and shaped into something you could cut into wedges. Dads loved it because it was simple but filling. Kids loved it because it was pasta, but fun. And everyone loved it because the whole thing could be made ahead and baked when the guests arrived. On Father's Day, it stood out on the table without trying too hard. Covered in melted mozzarella and baked until golden at the edges, it had all the comfort of spaghetti night with a little extra flair. These days, spaghetti pie is more of a vintage cookbook curiosity than a modern staple, but one taste might make you wonder why it ever left. It had structure, it had flavor, and it had Father's Day written all over it. The roast leg of lamb was never a dish you made without a reason. It was elegant, time-consuming, and the kind of recipe that took a few days of mental prep before you even took the meat out of the fridge. But when Father's Day came around, and you really wanted to make something memorable, this was the showpiece. The leg was seasoned with garlic, rosemary, and olive oil, then slow roasted until it reached that perfect balance between tender and just a little pink. The sides were usually kept simple, maybe some roasted potatoes or glazed carrots. But what stood out was the mint jelly. Bright green, unapologetically sweet, and served in a little dish that only came out once a year, it was the final flourish on a plate built to impress. For dads who had a taste for the finer things, maybe the ones who watched a little too much Julia Child, this was the crown jewel. Today it feels a bit too formal for most homes, and mint jelly has all but disappeared from grocery aisles. But back then, it was a plate that said, "We pulled out all the stops, just for you." And it always tasted like a moment. Pork ribs baked in root beer barbecue sauce were not your average weeknight dinner. This was a Father's Day meal made for getting your hands messy. The ribs were slow cooked in the oven or on the grill, basted in a homemade sauce that used root beer as its secret ingredient. The soda brought sweetness, caramel depth, and a slight fizz that helped the meat stay tender while it baked. Sticky, smoky, and falling off the bone, these ribs were the kind of dish that filled the backyard with a smell so good it should have been bottled and sold. Dads who loved barbecue, or even just loved to feel like pitmasters for the day, always got a twinkle in their eye when these showed up on the menu. It was not just food, it was an event. Cornbread and baked beans on the side, maybe a cold potato salad in the fridge, and a stack of napkins at the ready. These ribs made Father's Day feel like a summer festival, even if it was just dinner with family. They were messy, they were bold, and they reminded everyone at the table that food could be fun. Hungarian goulash might not sound like a typical Father's Day dish, but it had everything a hearty meal needed: beef, paprika, and patience. This was not a quick stew. It took hours to cook, letting the chunks of beef simmer with bell peppers, onions, and tomatoes until everything became tender and richly flavored. The real secret was the paprika, sometimes sweet, sometimes smoky, but always generous. The smell of it would fill the entire house and make everyone feel like something special was happening in the kitchen. Goulash was usually served with buttered bread or over egg noodles, and that warm, red-stained gravy soaked into every bite. It was filling, it was rustic, and it was always made in a big pot, because second helpings were not optional, they were expected. For dads with a European background or simply a taste for the old world, goulash was a favorite. It was a hug in a bowl with just enough spice to keep it interesting. These days, it is more of a nostalgic memory than a regular dish, but its flavor and heartiness still hold up. It was a dish that said, "You deserve something rich and made with love." Beef pot roast with pearl onions and turnips was less of a recipe and more of a ritual. The process started early in the day, searing the roast, deglazing the pot, and adding just the right mix of broth, herbs, and hearty vegetables. Pearl onions, carrots, and turnips were not just filler, they were the soul of the dish, softening into the gravy and soaking up every drop of beefy goodness. The whole thing went into the oven or slow cooker and stayed there for hours, sending waves of aroma through the house that wrapped around you like a wool blanket. On Father's Day, this was the kind of meal that told a story. It took time, it took intention, and it always led to a table filled with silence, not from lack of conversation, but because everyone was too busy eating. For dads who loved a meat and potatoes kind of dinner but still wanted something with depth, pot roast never disappointed. Today, it might seem too old school or too heavy, but one bite and you would understand why this dish could anchor a holiday. It was warmth, it was memory, and it always brought people together. Chicken fried steak with white gravy was not delicate, and it certainly was not light, but it was delicious. This Southern classic took a cheap cut of beef, often round or cube steak, and turned it into something worth celebrating. The meat was tenderized, breaded, and fried like chicken, then smothered in creamy white pepper gravy. The crust was crunchy, the inside was juicy, and the whole thing tasted like a meal built for someone who had worked hard and deserved to eat even harder. On Father's Day, it was a Southern dad's dream meal. Served with mashed potatoes, green beans, and maybe a sweet tea on the side, it was as close to diner heaven as you could get without leaving your kitchen. The gravy itself was an event, made with drippings from the pan, thickened just right, and poured with abandon. These days, it is not something most people attempt at home. Too much mess, too much grease. But for those who grew up with it, chicken fried steak was a rite of passage. It tasted like the South. It tasted like pride. And for one Sunday every June, it made Dad feel like royalty. Shrimp scampi over angel hair pasta was never cheap, which is why it only showed up for special occasions. But when Father's Day rolled around and seafood was Dad's request, this was the splurge that felt worth every penny. The shrimp were sautéed in a pan with butter, garlic, lemon juice, and a splash of white wine. Then they were tossed with thin angel hair pasta, which soaked up the sauce like it was born to do just that. Sometimes a pinch of red pepper flakes was added for a little heat. Sometimes a dusting of parsley to finish. But the flavors were always bright, rich, and totally satisfying. It was not heavy like other pasta dishes. It was delicate, but full of impact. For dads who liked a little elegance or dreamed of coastal getaways, shrimp scampi was the ticket. It looked restaurant-worthy, but still felt like home. You do not see it as often anymore, maybe because shrimp got pricey or because people forgot how simple good scampi can be. But it was one of those meals that made everyone lean in after the first bite. This was celebration food. No question about it. Fried catfish with hush puppies and slaw was the kind of meal that came with stories, usually about fishing trips, or growing up in the South, or learning how to fry without setting off the smoke alarm. Catfish was coated in seasoned cornmeal, fried until crisp, and served hot with crunchy hush puppies and a chilled scoop of coleslaw. It hit every note, salty, crispy, creamy, and tangy all at once. On Father's Day, especially in rural areas, this was a go-to plate that felt like a slice of personal history. It was food that reminded dads of simpler times, of family reunions and church picnics, of riverside afternoons and screened-in porches. The hush puppies, those little balls of fried cornmeal, were more than a side dish. They were essential. and the slaw balanced it all out, cool and sharp against the hot golden catfish. Today, fried catfish is not something most people make at home. It has become a regional specialty, something you search out in diners or fish shacks. But for those who remember it, it was never just a meal. It was a memory on a plate. Baked ziti with Italian sausage was not just dinner. It was an event, especially when it was made in one of those big, heavy casserole dishes that barely fit in the oven. The pasta was cooked, then tossed with ricotta, marinara, mozzarella, and plenty of sliced Italian sausage. Everything was layered and baked until it bubbled at the edges and developed that perfect crust of brown cheese on top. When Father's Day rolled around and Dad wanted something hearty, this dish was guaranteed to deliver. It fed a crowd, froze well, and left you looking forward to leftovers in a way most meals never could. The sausage brought spice, the cheese brought comfort, and the whole thing came together in a way that felt like a celebration. It was messy, filling, and deeply satisfying. Today, we tend to shy away from dishes that take this much cheese and this many steps. But baked ziti was never meant to be light. It was meant to be loved. Beef Wellington was the kind of dish that turned the kitchen into a stage. Every step, from searing the tenderloin to spreading the mushroom duxelles to wrapping it all in puff pastry, felt like part of a performance. It was precise, it was elegant, and when done right, it was breathtaking. On Father's Day, if you had a dad who loved cooking shows or just appreciated a little culinary drama, this was the meal that stole the spotlight. The outside baked into a golden crust, the inside stayed pink and juicy, and slicing into it revealed perfect layers. Mushroom, meat, pastry, every bite buttery and rich. It took time, it took skill. And that was the whole point. This was not a throw-it-in-the-oven dish. It was something you planned, prepared, and presented like a gift. And that is exactly what it was. Today, beef Wellington is more likely to show up in a cooking competition than a family kitchen, but there was a time when it was the crown jewel of holiday meals. It said, "You are worth the effort." And on Father's Day, that message could not have been clearer. Cornish game hens were never about portion size. They were about presentation. These tiny roasted birds made every place setting feel like it came from a fine dining restaurant instead of the kitchen down the hall. For Father's Day, they offered something personal. One hen per plate, browned and crispy on the outside, with a rich, savory stuffing hidden inside. That stuffing was often wild rice, mixed with mushrooms, onions, and sometimes dried fruit or pecans, giving it a nutty depth that played perfectly with the bird's delicate flavor. The hens were basted with butter or apricot glaze and roasted to a golden finish, creating a meal that felt both elegant and intimate. Dads loved them because they felt fancy. Families loved them because they were fun to eat and made the table look like a banquet. It was a special occasion dish, but one that did not require hours in the kitchen once the prep was done. Venison stew was not found in many city cookbooks, but in rural homes and hunting families, it was a Father's Day favorite with a story behind every bite. The venison was often hunted by the same dad who would eat it, making it more than just a meal, but a reward for patience, skill, and a little cold weather perseverance. The stew was thick and rich, built around slow-cooked chunks of deer meat, potatoes, carrots, and earthy spices. It simmered for hours, filling the house with an unmistakable aroma, somewhere between comfort food and campfire memory. The broth turned deep brown and hearty, especially when made with homemade stock or a splash of red wine. The result was a meal that could warm you to the bone and satisfy even the hungriest dads. It was the flavor of outdoors brought inside. It was the memory of a good shot. And it was the kind of dish that made Father's Day feel both rugged and sacred. Barbecue chicken quarters were never about subtlety. They were messy, smoky, and finger-licking good, the kind of thing that made the paper towel stack more important than the place settings. Chicken quarters, with drumsticks and thighs still attached, were seasoned and grilled low and slow, then slathered in a sticky, molasses-based sauce. That sauce caramelized under the heat, turning sweet and smoky with a touch of char at the edges. You could taste the sunshine in every bite. On Father's Day, this was often the star of backyard cookouts. Dad stood at the grill with a beer in hand and a pair of tongs like they were born to it. And the smell? That thick, sugary smoke curling through the yard was better than any scented candle money could buy. Kids loved how the meat pulled off the bone. Moms appreciated that cleanup was mostly done outside. Back then, when it was homemade and served with grilled corn and coleslaw, it was nothing short of Father's Day perfection. Turkey tetrazzini was the rare dish that turned leftovers into something worth celebrating. The base was usually from a roast turkey made earlier in the week, chopped or shredded, then folded into a creamy sauce with peas, mushrooms, and egg noodles. Everything was tossed together in a casserole dish, sprinkled with breadcrumbs or parmesan, and baked until golden and bubbling. It had the cozy charm of a potluck dish, but with just enough flair to feel festive. On Father's Day, it was often made when the budget was tight, but the desire to make something warm and filling remained strong. It was not about what you had, it was about what you could make of it. Dads appreciated the richness, kids loved the soft noodles and cheesy crust, and everyone had a favorite corner of the pan where the edges turned crispy. And on Father's Day, it felt like a quiet kind of gratitude. Barbecue meatball skewers were one of those recipes that felt fun from start to finish. The meatballs were homemade, ground beef, breadcrumbs, eggs, and spices, rolled and browned before getting skewered with chunks of bell pepper and onion. Then came the grill. That fire turned each skewer into a smoky, charred masterpiece, brushing on sauce with every turn. The barbecue glaze bubbled and stuck to the edges, creating a mix of crispy bits and juicy centers that made everyone at the table reach for seconds. On Father's Day, they were an outdoor cooking dream. Easy to serve, easy to share, and packed with flavor. No forks required, just a napkin and a smile. These skewers often sat alongside corn on the cob and macaroni salad, turning the backyard into something that felt a little like a festival. Dads loved them for the flavor. Kids loved them because they felt like eating party food, and moms loved them because you could make everything ahead. Country ham with red-eye gravy and grits was not delicate, but it was deliciously bold. The ham was cured, salty, and sliced thick, fried up in a cast-iron skillet until it sizzled and browned at the edges. That pan was not washed. Instead, strong black coffee was poured right in, scraping up all the salty bits to make the legendary red-eye gravy. The result was thin, dark, and bracing, a sauce that could jolt you awake just as much as it could wake up your taste buds. Served over buttery grits, this breakfast-for-dinner classic was a Southern dad's dream meal. It was strong, it was savory, and it never needed any dressing up. On Father's Day, when the goal was to serve something with grit, literally and figuratively, this was the plate to beat. The ham brought the flavor, the gravy brought the punch, and the grits soaked up every drop. It might not look fancy on a plate, but it had history and heart. Today, red-eye gravy has gone quiet in cookbooks, but in the homes where it once ruled, it will always be remembered as the sauce that did not mess around. Roasted duck with orange marmalade glaze was the kind of dinner that made the kitchen feel like a five-star restaurant, even if it was just Father's Day at home. The duck itself took time, cleaned, seasoned, and slow roasted to render out the fat and crisp the skin. It was not an everyday meat. That was the point. This was a bird for special occasions, a little fancier, a little richer, and a lot more memorable. What really sealed the deal was the glaze. Orange marmalade warmed and brushed on near the end, giving the duck a sweet, citrusy sheen that played perfectly with the gamey meat. The result was crispy skin, juicy bites, and a plate that looked as good as it tasted. Dads who liked to try something different or had a taste for bold flavors loved this dish. It felt celebratory, it felt grown up, and it turned the dining room into something worth setting the good table for. These days, duck rarely makes an appearance outside of restaurants. But back when family meals had ambition, this was one dish that made Father's Day unforgettable. Shepherd's pie was never flashy, but it was solid, dependable. a layer of seasoned beef or lamb with onions and carrots, topped with mashed potatoes and baked until golden. It was the kind of meal that made everyone full and happy without saying much. For Father's Day, especially in colder states or homes with old country roots, shepherd's pie was a favorite. It felt warm, it looked humble, and it always came in a dish big enough to feed the table with leftovers to spare. The mashed potatoes crisped slightly at the edges, while the bottom stayed rich and savory. It was a spoonful of everything. Dads loved it for its no-nonsense approach. Kids loved it because it was easy to eat. And for the one making it, it said, "Here is something hearty for you." Today, it has been pushed aside by newer trends, but it still holds its own when it comes to comforting dinners that say, "You matter." Sloppy Joes were never about elegance, but they had heart, especially when made from scratch, with beef simmered in tangy tomato sauce seasoned with mustard and brown sugar. No can, just a skillet of meat piled onto soft buns. On Father's Day weekends, this was the meal that said, "Kick back." Served with pickles, potato chips, and maybe a soda, Sloppy Joes were the ultimate casual reward. They came together fast, but still felt special. Dads who spent the day mowing or fixing things could sit down and eat with both hands. It got messy, it got loud, and it always got seconds. These days, we lean toward gourmet burgers or sliders. But back then, a well-made Sloppy Joe was perfect. Nostalgic, satisfying, exactly the kind of food that belonged on a paper plate at the end of a good day. Grilled London broil was a lean cut that needed a little planning, but when done right, it was worth it. The steak was marinated for hours, soy sauce, garlic, vinegar, and spices, soaking in flavor and tenderizing the meat. Then it hit the grill, seared fast to lock in the juices before being sliced thin. The result was smoky slices with flavor in every bite. On Father's Day, this was a go-to for dads who liked their steak with edge. It felt rugged, classic, no sauces, no fanfare. Just good meat, grilled right. Served with vegetables or roasted potatoes, it made a plate that was simple and satisfying. London broil never needed to be pricey to feel impressive. And back when families spent more time outside, it was a summer staple. Today, it is less common, passed over for fattier cuts. But back then, it was how you did more with less, and still made dinner feel like something special. Pan-fried chicken livers with white bread was dinner for people who grew up eating what others threw away. The livers hissed in the pan, sending up sharp, metallic smells that filled the house like a warning. Dad would coat them in flour, maybe a little salt, and fry them until they were crisp on the outside and soft in the middle. The texture was defiant, grainy, creamy, chewy all at once. And the taste? Bold, bloody, unapologetic. A slab of white bread went underneath to catch the grease, turning soggy by the first bite. No sides, no drinks, just meat and bread, hot and fast. You gagged your way through the first few dinners, nose pinched and throat tight. But over time, it became something else. A dare, a memory, a lesson in not wasting food just because it made you uncomfortable. He would say, "It is good for you," as if that was supposed to help. Maybe it did. Or maybe you just learned that not all care comes wrapped in sweetness. Sometimes it comes sizzling in a skillet, daring you to be brave. And sometimes you were, even if you never ate it again. Steak has long been a staple of romantic dinners, but mid-century home cooks weren't just grilling, they were experimenting. By the 1960s, culinary influences from Europe and Latin America introduced the idea that steak didn't need to be seasoned only with salt and pepper. Enter cocoa and espresso, two ingredients that, when used carefully, enhance the natural umami of beef with depth and smokiness. Cocoa in savory dishes wasn't new. Mexican cuisine had been using chocolate in mole for centuries. Espresso, with its rich bitterness, amplified the complexity. Together, they formed a crust that was bold, aromatic, and undeniably elegant. Perfect for a Valentine's dinner at home, it was a dish designed to impress. So why did this flavor combination fade? Timing played a role. As the 1980s and 90s ushered in a preference for ultra-rich, butter-basted steaks, the idea of adding cocoa and coffee seemed almost unnecessary. Meanwhile, the rise of pre-marinated cuts made homemade rubs less common in everyday cooking. But food trends are cyclical, and this is one worth reviving. After all, steak is already a classic Valentine's dish. Why not give it a touch of culinary artistry? Stuffed green peppers with rice and ground beef were the kind of dinner that made kids groan and dads proud. The peppers were cut with care, hollowed out like tiny edible bowls, and stuffed with a mix of meat, white rice, and a splash of tomato sauce that always seemed too thin. They stood upright in the baking dish like tired little soldiers, roasting under foil until everything went soft and indistinct. The smell was strong, peppery, acidic, with that unmistakable steam from inside a vegetable aroma. Dad would scoop one onto each plate, then drown it in more sauce to hide how dry the meat had turned. Kids scraped out the insides and left the pepper holes behind like edible husks. But you ate it, because it was dinner, and Dad made it, and not eating it was not an option. There was something strangely sacred about the routine. The stuffing, the baking, the way he stood by the stove waiting for it to be done enough. You never asked him why he kept making it. Maybe it was because it reminded him of something older, something he wanted to preserve, even if nobody else at the table ever asked for seconds. Baked Alaska, once the pinnacle of dining elegance with its combination of cake, ice cream, and meringue, has faded in popularity due to its perceived complexity and the rise of simpler, more accessible desserts. The challenge of perfectly executing the meringue and achieving the flambé effect can be daunting for home bakers, contributing to its decline. Additionally, in a culinary landscape that values quick and straightforward recipes, Baked Alaska's time-consuming preparation makes it less appealing for everyday dessert choices. However, its dramatic presentation and the contrast of hot and cold elements retain a potential allure, suggesting that deconstructed or simplified versions could bring it back into favor for special occasions. Sushi burritos were a food trend that started around the tail end of the 2000s. They were one of the most popular fusion trends because it was the first time anyone had thought to do anything new with sushi, really. Who was responsible for this, though? The sushi burrito is something we can thank Sam Yu and Peter Yen for. They're the ones who founded the iconic Sushirito restaurant in San Francisco, and that was in 2011, but they were cooking up the idea for a while before. Basically, the brainchild here this time was to take a sushi roll and make it into a much bigger meal. Instead of the usual bite-sized portion, they thought it would work better if it was a burrito-sized roll. While it did get some backlash from a lot of people who were sushi purists and big-time traditionalists, it was a massive hit with other people. It was new, fresh, and there was also a lot more of it to eat, which is a complaint people often keep having with sushi. I mean, it's good, but it's expensive and it doesn't really fill you up. Luckily, with the sushi burrito, you don't have to worry about that kind of thing at all. Cabbage and kielbasa skillet was the dinner equivalent of airing out the house, with the windows shut. The pan would hit the burner, oil would sizzle, and in went the chopped kielbasa, filling the kitchen with a smell that stuck to the walls. Then came the cabbage, shredded roughly and dumped in like it owed somebody money. It steamed, wilted, and soaked up all the fat until it turned soft and slightly sweet. Black pepper, maybe a splash of vinegar, maybe not. Dad called it hearty. The rest of the family called it something else. Plates were filled, noses were pinched, and leftovers always outlasted the enthusiasm. But still, it was filling. It was cheap. It cooked in one pan and made enough for tomorrow. That kind of meal was not meant to impress. It was meant to last. And when you sat there chewing through another forkful of limp cabbage and greasy sausage, you knew this was not about taste. It was about getting through the week with enough money left for gas. You can almost hear the fork scraping the plate even now. That sound, more than the smell, is what stuck with you. It always meant dinner was done. Crepe Suzette, featuring thin pancakes and a showy orange sauce, added a touch of French elegance to the table, impressing with its dramatic flambé performance. However, its decline in popularity can be attributed to the modern diner's preference for quicker, less intricate desserts. The preparation of crêpe Suzette, particularly the flambé technique, while theatrical, may seem intimidating to the home cook and overly elaborate for casual dining. Additionally, the shift towards lighter, health-conscious dessert options has overshadowed richer, buttery desserts. Despite this, crêpe Suzette holds potential for resurgence with adaptations that simplify the recipe without compromising its essence, catering to the contemporary interest in both gourmet home cooking and healthier, refined sweets. Meatloaf made with saltine crackers instead of breadcrumbs was dense, dry, and strangely loved. Dad would mash the ground beef with his bare hands, crush the crackers right in, and slap the whole thing into a loaf pan without ceremony. Ketchup went on top, thick and glossy, forming a red crust that bubbled when it cooked. He would call it real food, and you were not allowed to disagree. Sometimes it came with instant mashed potatoes or a can of green beans dumped into a bowl without heating. But the meatloaf was the centerpiece. You chewed longer than you wanted to. You drank more milk than usual just to get it down. But you never left it unfinished. That would have been disrespectful. This was not about flavor. It was about effort, about stretching 1 pound of beef to feed 5 people and pretending it was enough. And every so often, late at night, you wonder why you still remember the exact taste of saltines and beef. Kentucky's Burgoo Fest in Owensboro is actually one of the best things to do in the whole state. The Burgoo Festival is one of the most renowned festivals across the country, and Owensboro itself is known as the Burgoo capital of the world, too. The actual history of the burgoo comes from the 19th century African-American communities that first made this into a southern dish. A lot of them were working in plantations and had to really play clever with their ingredients, and this meant that burgoo was something people couldn't live without. That only got worse when the Civil War rolled around and people started incorporating the recipe into the mainstream due to its ability to feed massive groups of people. The burgoo itself is this really thick and dense stew that has mashed potatoes, chicken, and all kinds of vegetables. You know those little quirks that each state has? The kind of thing that it becomes popular for, that everyone starts recognizing it for? That's basically what this was. Friday nights meant beer-battered fish, and not the fancy kind. This was frozen fish fillets straight from the discount freezer, dropped into a pan with too much oil and a prayer they would crisp. The smell took over the whole house. Grease, fish, and that sour twang from the slaw made earlier that morning. Dad did not plate these, he stacked them. 3 to a person, on paper towels that absorbed half their weight in oil. Store-brand tartar sauce plopped on the side like an afterthought. If he was feeling generous, there were fries too, dumped from a bag, half-baked, some still cold in the middle. There was no conversation around these meals, just the sound of crunching and the occasional grunt of approval. You remember those nights not for their joy, but for their reliability. No matter how long the week had been, the fish fillets showed up. Greasy, crispy, predictable. A small comfort in a house that needed one. Goat cheese and beet ravioli was another continuation of these same trends. Now, beet actually has a lot of claim to fame here. It has every right to be at the forefront after the legendary career it had in the first half of the 20th century. If you're not sure what I'm talking about, beet became one of the go-to options for people as far as food went, period. I don't mean beet as a side or as a snack, I mean it was all you had to eat that day. The Depression and wartime periods popularized the concept of eating vegetables like beets in whatever form you could manage. Roasting them, baking them, boiling them, you name it, somebody was doing it. That's probably why this dish was met with a pretty open reception. Goat cheese wasn't anything exactly new either. What was new was the idea of using both of these in the form of ravioli, which wasn't exactly too much of a stretch, but it definitely wasn't anything people were accustomed to. Still, when the dish eventually did start becoming popular in restaurants and Italian vegetarian restaurants, it became a national hit. The vegans really went crazy for this one, man. Hot dogs and baked beans in one greasy, bubbling skillet. It was a meal born from efficiency and a total lack of concern for culinary flair. Dad would cut the hot dogs into uneven coins, dump the beans straight from the can, and give it all a stir like he was building something permanent. This was the dinner that came out on laundry days, on evenings when no one wanted to talk, or after a ball game when the fridge was nearly empty. You could smell the sugar and salt from the driveway. The beans were soft and sweet, the hot dogs a little blistered from the cast-iron pan that never quite got clean between uses. Sometimes he would throw a slice of American cheese on top and let it melt into a strange orange skin. It looked like something you should not eat, but you did. You always did. Because it was fast, and it was there, and Dad did not take requests. You sat down, you ate what was made, and you learned to pretend the burnt bits were the best part. For centuries, knots have symbolized love and commitment. In medieval Europe, young couples exchanged knotted cords as a sign of devotion. Some historians even trace the phrase "tying the knot" back to these traditions. So it's no surprise that home bakers once embraced the symbolism, crafting soft pretzels into love knots for Valentine's Day. Pretzels themselves have an old-world charm, dating back to monks in the 7th century who shaped dough to resemble folded arms in prayer. But by the 20th century, they had taken on a sweeter side. Home cooks dipped them in cinnamon sugar, drizzled them with honey, or, in true Valentine spirit, served them with warm chocolate for a romantic touch. The contrast of salty and sweet made them an unexpected but perfect addition to the holiday table. So why did this charming tradition fade? Simplicity took over. The rise of store-bought chocolates and prepackaged sweets meant fewer people were willing to knead, twist, and bake homemade dough. And in a world where Valentine's treats became all about visual appeal, pretzels, no matter how lovingly shaped, couldn't compete with glossy heart-shaped confections. But for those who appreciate the beauty of handcrafted traditions, Love Knot pretzels prove that some of the best Valentine's treats don't come in a box. They're made by hand, one twist at a time. Buffalo wings are a New York classic that came out of the 1960s, but the idea of buffalo cauliflower wings was something that may have started both as a part of mock culture and as a part of the plant-based trends that were going on, along with how veganism was really on the rise. The head of the cauliflower would be cut into these bite-sized, wing-like shapes, and then you'd cook it in this batter that had a lot of cornstarch. You could bake it too, but afterwards, you'd just coat it in the sauce. It was actually pretty close, at least in texture, to the original thing. Meat eaters of all varieties, casual and die-hard, disagreed as hard as they could. To them, it was like an affront to God. How dare my buffalo wings be tormented this way? To the vegans, it was a pretty neat little counter-argument. They found a dish that pretty much perfectly mimicked the way meat felt. Savory pastries have always been a mark of refined entertaining. While desserts often dominate Valentine's Day, elegant appetizers once played just as important a role. In the mid-20th century, small, handcrafted tarts filled with rich, tangy cheeses were a staple at romantic dinners and cocktail parties alike. They were a way to start a meal with sophistication, bite-sized, decadent, and just enough to whet the appetite. Goat cheese, with its creamy texture and slight tang, was a natural choice. Though commonly associated with French cuisine, it gained popularity in the U.S. during the 1960s, as Americans developed a taste for more artisanal dairy products. Pink peppercorns, often mistaken for true pepper, added a floral heat, while honey balanced the sharpness. The result was a tart that was bold, delicate, and undeniably gourmet. So why aren't these little bites still a Valentine staple? One reason is shifting food trends. By the late 20th century, cheese boards replaced carefully crafted cheese tarts, offering the same flavor profile with less effort. At the same time, home entertaining changed. Fewer people were making intricate appetizers from scratch. Canned chili over cornbread squares was not glamorous, but it was hot, fast, and filled the entire house with the smell of cumin and canned tomatoes. Dad would bake a tray of cornbread from a box mix, the kind that came out too dry at the edges and too wet in the middle. He would cut it into uneven blocks, slap them on a plate, and pour a can of chili right on top, beans and all. It soaked in immediately, turning the cornbread into a spicy sponge that crumbled under the fork. Sometimes he would add shredded cheese if there was any left in the bag. But most nights, it was just the two elements, chili and corn, and the kind of silence that comes from people who are too tired to argue, and waited for that full feeling that told you it was time to stop. It was not good, not really. But it was warm, and it was easy, and it made you feel like someone had tried, even if just a little. And for dads who came home tired and out of ideas, sometimes trying was enough. I always say America's really just one big melting pot of bits and pieces from everywhere, from around the world. Duck confit tacos make me think I'm right, because where else does Mexican food meet French cuisine, all for commercial, everyday eating? Yet that's exactly what duck confit tacos are. The tradition of confit itself is something that's been exclusive to France for decades. Basically, you take those juicy duck legs and cook them in duck fat, and that gives you meat that's pretty much ready to fall off of the bone at any given moment. Plus, that flavor is to die for. Now, that naturally makes it the perfect kind of meat for a taco, and most spices and toppings available at taco places, like corn and sour cream, went really well with duck confit tacos. It's not something you'd find at taco joints now, but it used to be one of the most popular tacos to get during the stretch between 2003 and 2007. There was something about the way the 2000s elevated street food into being this actual culinary experience where you could just spend the day roaming the streets, trying new things from new fusion food stalls. It really made the whole decade magical. Vienna sausages and rice was what happened when creativity met desperation. Those little pink logs slid out of the can with a slurp, already fully cooked and vaguely unsettling. Dad would chop them into coins, toss them in a pan, and fry them until the edges browned. Then came the rice, usually leftover, sometimes instant, always plain. Everything mixed together in one skillet, maybe with a splash of soy sauce if it was around. It was not pretty, it was not gourmet, but it fed whoever was hungry without complaints or compliments. You ate it with a spoon, straight from the bowl, wondering why it sort of worked. Maybe it was the salt, maybe it was the crunch, or maybe it was the fact that dinner showed up, even when the paycheck did not. Vienna sausages were a punchline everywhere else, but at home, they were just another tool in the kitchen survival kit. Looking back, you wonder how many of those meals were thrown together out of necessity, not choice, and how many times you were fed by someone who never let on how close the margin really was. So, soufflé potatoes are their own little niche corner of Louisiana comfort. A lot of people claim that the origins of this dish come from the days when French cooking had taken over the minds of almost every home chef in America. This is mostly because the way these potatoes are made is a French tradition, but it is one that's been adopted by Louisiana ever since the early days of the 20th century. Here, what you basically do is fry the potatoes twice. Once, you fry them at a low temperature in hot oil, which helps soften the potatoes up. This gives them that lightness that they're so well known for. Then, the second time you fry them, you really turn up the heat and make sure they get a perfectly golden, crunchy exterior. This gives them that airiness they're so used to. It's pretty much one of the most well-received side dishes, and in some restaurants and fine dining circles, even an amazing main course. It's actually really easy to mess this up though, because frying it at just the wrong temperature and being just a little bit off on the timing can be pretty disastrous. You might end up with a burnt soufflé or something that just doesn't feel good to bite into at all. Butter noodles and canned green beans were the fallback dinner, the no frills, no meat, no explanation kind of meal that filled a plate when nothing else could. The noodles were overboiled, slippery, and tossed with margarine and salt until they shone. The green beans came from a can, soft, salty, and the same dull green every time. They were served side by side, often in silence. Dad did not explain. He just scooped, served, and sat. You could tell it was one of those nights by the way he exhaled before even sitting down. There was no protein, no recipe, no conversation, just starch, salt, and survival. But somehow, it worked. The noodles stuck to your ribs, the beans filled the corners. You felt full, even if nothing felt special. And that was the point. Not every dinner was meant to impress. Some were just meant to make it through. Years later, the smell of canned beans still brings you back. Not to hunger, but to that tired, quiet love that never said much but showed up anyway, even when it had nothing to work with. Coconut lemongrass chicken meatballs, on the other hand, were an instant hit with just about everyone that tried them. This fusion of Thai and Vietnamese cuisines shows just how much America had become not only a fan of globalization, but a center for it too. Just look at this list alone. How many different types of cuisines are we drawing from already? From Mexican and Japanese classics to Mediterranean traditions and the flavors of the Caribbean or the Middle East. Coconut milk and lemongrass were a pretty lovely pairing that people knew immediately was going to work. It was a fusion dish that was supposed to take the comfort food factor of meatballs and combine it with new flavors and ingredients that gave it a lot of oomph. It didn't have better. Lemongrass and coconut milk were really fragrant ingredients that just added this air of flashiness to your meal. I guess you can already tell that Vietnamese food was also making quite an impression thanks to things like PHO, but these were a good way of keeping meatballs in circulation. That's how these dishes became such staples in the first place, I think. They never shy away from adapting to the times. Ham and elbow macaroni were never meant to go together, but in a working dad's kitchen, they did more than coexist. They thrived. This was the kind of dinner that began with the sharp hiss of a can opener and ended with a squirt of ketchup right into the pan. Spam cubes sizzling in a little too much oil, tossed with boiled noodles and whatever frozen vegetable bag had the least frostbite. It was salty, greasy, and strangely addictive, like a sodium-heavy hug. Dad never measured anything. He used the wooden spoon like a shovel, moving everything around until it looked cooked. Sometimes there were eggs, sometimes there was soy sauce, but mostly it was just spam, macaroni, and the kind of silence that comes after a long shift. You ate it out of chipped bowls or straight from the pot, depending on how many dishes were left clean. This was not just a meal, it was a midweek ritual. He would always say the same thing, "You will live." And he was right. It was not glamorous, it was not healthy, but it was hot, and it was home. And the smell of fried spam still feels like someone trying their best. So, the best part about going to South Carolina is easily the frogmore stew that you can find in the low-country parts of the state. Despite what the name implies, rest assured, there aren't any toads or frogs that will jump out from your bowl of stew. It's just a small little reference to Frogmore. This is a community that you can find in St. Helena Island, located in South Carolina. It's said that this is where the dish first came from, and it's a one-pot boil that's become pretty closely associated with Carolina cuisine. This seafood boil pretty much is made of all the basic ingredients you would imagine modern boils to use. You have your mashed potatoes, corn on the cob, shrimp, vegetables, and spices, and it really is one of those crowd-pleasing dishes I talked about earlier. It's nearly impossible to go wrong with this dish because it's got a lot of variety. If you're sitting with a group of people who aren't the biggest fans of shrimp, you can throw in some cod, some oysters, or crab. Whatever kind of seafood gets the current group going, it can work in frogmore stew. Since this is entirely a boil, it's also pretty nutritious. This is part of why the dish got so popular, since people living on the Carolina coast would rely on one-pot boils like these, which made use of the catch of the day. Tuna casserole with crushed potato chip topping was how Dad turned pantry scraps into something resembling dinner. A can of tuna, a can of cream of mushroom soup, a handful of overcooked egg noodles stirred together in a baking dish like a dare. Then came the chips, not for flavor, but for texture, and maybe for drama. He would crush them right in the bag and scatter the crumbs across the top like a finale. Into the oven it went, and out came something gray, bubbling, and strangely cheerful. The chips browned at the edges, curling like leaves in a fire. The smell was fishy, salty, and oddly comforting. Everyone pretended to like it, or at least no one complained loud enough to stop it. It was hot, filling, and could be made from whatever was on sale, and that was the goal. You do not remember the taste as much as you remember the sound, the crunch of chips under the fork, the scrape of the spoon hitting the casserole dish, the silence when it was gone. Years later, you cannot eat tuna without thinking of that chipped Pyrex pan and the way Dad would nod when it came out just right. I keep mentioning these food trucks, but it's important to add a bit of context to them. I really don't think things like faux grilled cheese sandwiches would have had the spotlight for any amount of time without them, really. You gotta think about the idea, you know? Ice cream trucks were all the rage, and the entire idea was that there was just literally a truck that went from area to area or was stationed at a specific one. It was magnetic. It attracted people to the food, and it was an excuse to go out instead of ordering takeout. Pho and grilled cheese are both things that really don't go together, though. So how did the combination work exactly? Well, you had to tinker around. It wasn't like they just gave you a bowl of pho and expected you to work with that. They'd often boil the broth and reduce it until the flavors were so concentrated in what was really just a dip at that point that it worked perfectly with the grilled sandwich. Plus, some food trucks had the sandwich incorporate things you would find in pho so that it would go better overall when you'd bite it. Pretty thoughtful, right? Share your favorite dad dish in the comments. Give us a like if you felt nostalgic, and subscribe for more hearty bites from the past.